Okay, why am I so high up on the screen? Anyway, hello. Welcome in. I'm still trying to fix some behind the scenes stuff, so I keep forgetting I haven't actually streamed for about, well, almost 2 weeks. And of course, all my setups need to be fixed again. So I'm just trying to get back into the swing of things. Because it don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. Do up, do up, do up, do up, do up. Okay. Sound alerts are on. TTS is on. Frosty Tools is up. And my timers are going. So I'm not too late. Why the hell did I just have the alerts thing in front of me? I guess a better question is, why is my model already frozen? Come on. Of course, that's going to have to pop back up again. Computer? Okay. So what was a news thing? What unlikely hero of World War II was used an unusual method to extinguish a bomb? Okay. The Great Dane peed on it. Why am I not surprised? Too many things to fix. I've got the head pad turned on. And the ear scratches. I don't have Top Wolf on. Don't have the cheapy ties on. Okay. I should be good. But anyway, welcome back, everyone. I, again, can't tell if my model is frozen or not. Because life happens that way. And I was looking back at my archives that said that when I was last reading this one, I had messed up so badly and had computer issues. Hey, Matsu. That dame. Okay, for some reason, Kel thinks you're a she. No, she's not exactly accurate most of the time. So, how's everything been in the interdimensional library? Oh, that's good. Didn't know if there was any mass chaos spilling over anywhere. Well, silent is good in a library and study. Makes it easier to focus on reading. As I was saying, last time I'd read from this book, I had started another section, then just started having computer problems, and I just scrapped that stream, so we're going to start where I tried to last time. And hopefully my computer won't act up as badly. So let's skip over to my study. And now I'm standing up at my... Why am I standing up? Okay. Make sure the fireplace is nice and warm. Because it has gotten cold here finally. I want to make sure there's a nice warm fire. Especially since I'm apparently supposed to have snow tonight. So that'll be fun. Let's see, 909. Yeah, making you start reading. So this is going to start another short series by the same author. That's going to be Richard Harding Davis. And In the Fog. And hopefully I won't be coughing this much. Anyway, In the Fog by Richard Harding Davis. The Grill was the most... And I'm already messing up. The Grill is the club most difficult of access in the world. To be placed on its rolls distinguishes the new member as greatly as though he had received a vacant garter or had been caricatured in Vanity Fair. Men who belong to the Grill Club never mention that fact. If you ask one of them which club he frequents, he will name all, save that particular one. He is afraid if he told you that he belonged to the Grill, that it would soon sound like boasting. The Grill Club dates back to the days when Shakespeare's theater stood on the present site of the Times office. It has a golden grill which Charles II presented to the club, and the original manuscript of Tom and Jerry in London, which was bequeathed to it by Pierce Egan himself. The members, when they write letters at the club, still use sand to blot the ink. The Grill enjoys the distinction of having, without political prejudice, blackballed a prime minister of each party. At the same sitting at which one of these fell, it elected, on account of his broke and his bulls, Quiller, the Queen's counsellor, who was then a penniless barrister. When Paul Preval, the French artist who came to London by royal command to paint the portrait of the Prince of Wales, was made an honorary member, only foreigners may be honorary members. He said as he signed his first wine card, "I would rather see my name on that than a picture in the Louvre." It actually says Tom and Jerry in London. It does say it's the one by Pierce Egan. At which Quiller remarked, "That is the devil of a compliment, because the only men who can read their names in the Louvre today have been dead 50 years. On the night after the Great Fog of 1897, there were 5 members in the club, 4 of them busy with supper, and 1 reading in front of the fireplace. There is only 1 room to the club, and 1 long table. At the far end of the room, the fire on the grill glows red, and when the fat falls, blazes into the flame. And at the other there is a broad bow window with diamond panes which looks down upon the street. The 4 men on the table were strangers to each other, but they picked at the grilled bones and sipped their scotch and soda, and they conversed with such charming animation that the visitor to the club, which does not tolerate visitors, would have counted them as friends, as long acquaintance, certainly not of Englishmen who had met without the form of an introduction and for the first time. But it is the etiquette and tradition of the grill that whoever enters it must speak with whomever he finds there. It is to enforce the rule that there is but 1 long table, and whether there are 20 men at it or 2, the waiters, supporting the rule, will place them side by side. For this reason, the 4 strangers at supper were seated together, with the candles grouped about them, and a long length of the table cutting the white path through the outer gloom of the room. "I repeat," said the gentleman with the black pearl stud, "that the days for romantic adventure and deeds of foolish daring have passed, and that the fault lies with ourselves. Voyages to the pole I do not catalogue as adventures. That African explorer, young Chetney, who turned up yesterday after he was supposed to have died in Uganda, did nothing adventurous. He made maps and explored the sources of rivers. He was in the constant danger, but the presence of danger does not constitute adventure. Were that so, the chemist who studies high explosives or who investigates deadly poisons passes through adventures daily. No, adventures are for the adventurous. But no one longer ventures. The spirit of it died of inertia. We are grown too practical, too just, above all, too sensible. In this room, for instance, members of this club have, at the sword's point, disputed a proper sconning of one of the Pope's couplets. Over weighty a matter has spilled burgundy on a gentleman's cuff. 10 men fought across the table, each with his rapier in one hand and a candle in the other. 10 well wounded. The question of the spilled burgundy concerned but 2 of them. The other 8 engaged because they were men of spirit. They were indeed the first gentlemen of their day. Tonight, were you to spill burgundy on my cuff, or you even to insult me grossly, these gentlemen would not consider it incumbent upon them to kill each other. They would separate us and appear as witnesses against us at the Bow Street tomorrow morning. We have here tonight, in the persons of Sir Andrew and myself, an illustrious of how the ways have changed." The men around the table turned and glanced towards the gentleman in front of the fireplace. He was an elderly and somewhat portly person, with a kindly wrinkled countenance, which wore continually a smile of almost childish confidence and good nature. It was a face which illustrated prints had made intimately familiar. He held a book from him at arm's length, and though to adjust to his high sight, and his brows were knit with interest. "Now we're in the 18th century," continued the gentleman with the black pearl. When Sir Andrew left the club tonight, I would have had him bound and gagged and thrown into a sedan chair. The watch would not interfere. The passers-by would not interfere, and they would take to their heels. My hired boys and ruffians could convey him to some lonely spot where we would guard him until morning. Nothing would come of it except an added reputation to myself as a gentleman of adventurous spirit, and possibly an essay in the Tatler, with stars for names entitled, let us say, The Budget and the Baronet. But what in, sir? Inquired the youngest of our members. And why Sir Andrew, of all persons? Why should you select him for this adventure? The gentleman with the black pearl shrugged his shoulders. It would prevent him from speaking at the House tonight. The Navy Increase Bill, he added gloomily. It is a government measure, and Sir Andrew speaks for it. And so great is his influence, and so large his following, that if he does, the gentleman laughed ruefully, if he does, it will go through. Now, had I the spirit of our ancestors, he exclaimed, I would bring chloroform from the nearest chemist and drug him in that chair. I would tumble his unconscious form into a hansom cab and hold him prisoner until daylight. If I did, I would save the British taxpayer the cost of 5 more battleships, and many millions of pounds. As the gentleman again turned and surveyed the baronets with freshened interest, the honorary member of the grill, whose accent had already betrayed him to be an American, laughed softly. To look at him now, he said, one would not guess he was so deeply concerned with the affairs of state. The others nodded silently. He has not lifted his eyes from that book since he entered, added the younger member. He surely cannot speak tonight. Oh, yes, he will speak, muttered the one with the black pearl moodily. During these last hours of session, the House sits late, but when the Navy Bill comes up on its 3rd reading, he will be in its place, and he will pass it. The 4th member, a stout and florid gentleman of a somewhat sporting appearance, in a short smoking jacket and black tie, sighed enviously. Fancy one of us being as cool as that. If he knew he had to stand up within an hour and rattle off a speech in Parliament. I'd be the devil of a funk myself, and yet he is as keen over that book he's reading as though he had nothing before him until bedtime. You see how eager he is, whispered the youngest member. He does not lift his eyes, even now, when it cuts the pages. It's probably the Admiralty report, or some other weighty work of statistics which bears upon his speech. The gentleman in the black pearl laughed morosely. Weighty work is which to the entitled statesman is so deeply engrossed, he said. It is called The Great Rand Robbery. It is a detective novel for sale at bookstalls. The American raised his eyebrows in disbelief. The Great Grand Robbery? He repeated incredulously. What an odd taste! It is not the taste, it is his vice, returned the gentleman with the pearl stud. It is his one dissipation. He is noted for it. You, as a stranger, could hardly be expected to know his idiosyncrasy. Mr. Gladstone thought relaxation in the Greek poets. Sir Andrew finds his in Gaborian. Since I have been a member of the Parliament, I have never seen him in the library without a shilling shocker in his hands. He brings them even to the sacred precincts of the House, and from the government benches reads them concealed beside his hat. Once started on a tale of murder, robbery, and sudden death, nothing can tear him from it. Not even the call of a devious bell, nor the hunger, nor the prayers of the whip party. He gave up his country home because he had journeyed to it in a train, but had become so absorbed in the detective stories that he would invariably be carried past the stop. The Member of Parliament twisted his pearl stud nervously, and a bit of the edge of his mustache. If it really were the first pages of Rand Robbery that he is reading now, he murmured bitterly, instead of the last, was such another book that I swear I could hold him here until morning. There would be no need for chloroform then to keep him from the house. His eyes were all fastened on Sir Andrew, and I saw with fascination that, with his forefinger, he was now separating the last 2 pages of the book. The Member of Parliament struck the table softly with his open palm. "I would give £100, he whispered, "if I could place in his hands this moment a new story from Sherlock Holmes. £1,000, he added wildly. £5,000. The American observed the speaker sharply, as though the words bore him with some special application, and then, at an idea which apparently had but just come to him, smiled with great embarrassment. Sir Andrew ceased reading, but, as though still under the influence of the book, sat looking blankly into the open fire. For a brief space of no more moved, until the baronet withdrew his eyes, and with a sudden start of recollection felt anxiously for his watch. He scanned its face eagerly and scrambled briskly to his feet. The voice of the American instantly broke the silence with a high, nervous accent. "And yet Sherlock Holmes himself," he cried, "could not decipher the mystery which tonight baffles the police of London." At these unexpected words, which carried in them something of the tone of a challenge, the gentleman about the table started as suddenly as though the American had fired a pistol in the air, and Sir Andrew halted abruptly and stood observing him with a grave surprise. The gentleman with the black pearl was the first to recover. Yes, yes," he said eagerly, throwing himself across the table. "A mystery that baffles the police in London. I had heard nothing of it. Tell us at once. Pray do. Tell us at once." The American flushed uncomfortably and picked uneasily at the tablecloth. "No one but police has heard it," he murmured, "and they only through me. It is a remarkable crime to which, unfortunately, I am the only person who can bear witness. Because I am the only witness. I am, in spite of my immunity as a diplomat, detained in London by the authorities of Scotland Yard. My name," he said, inclining his head politely, "is Sears, Lieutenant Ripley Sears, of the United States Navy, at present naval attaché to the court of Russia. Had I not been detained today by the police, I would have started this morning to Petersburg." The gentleman in the black pearl interrupted with so pronounced an exclamation of excitement and delight that the American stammered and ceased speaking. "Do you hear, Sir Andrew?" cried the member of the Parliament jubilantly. "As an American diplomat halted by our police because he's the only witness of a most remarkable crime." "The most remarkable crime, I believe you said, sir," he added, bending eagerly towards the naval officer, "which has occurred in London in many years." The American moved his head in assent and glanced at the 2 other members. They were looking doubtfully at him, and the face of each showed that he was greatly perplexed. Sir Andrew advanced to within the light of the candles and drew a chair towards him. "The crime must be exceptional indeed," he said, "to justify the police in interfering with a representative of friendly power. If I were not forced to leave at once, I should take the liberty of asking you to tell us the details." The gentleman with the pearl pushed the chair towards Sir Andrew and motioned him to be seated. "You cannot leave us now," he exclaimed. "Mr. Sears is just about to tell us of his remarkable crime." He nodded vigorously at the naval officer, and the American, after first glancing doubtfully towards the servants at the far end of the room, leaned forward across the table. The others drew their chairs nearer and bent towards him. The baronet glanced irresolutely at his watch, and with an exclamation of annoyance, snapped down the lid. "They can wait," he muttered. He seated himself quickly and nodded to the Lieutenant Sears. "If you would be so kind as to begin, sir," he said impatiently. "Oh, of course," said the American. "You understand that I am speaking to gentlemen. The confidences of this club are inviolable. Until the police give the facts to the public press, I must consider you my confederates. You've heard nothing, and you know no one connected to this mystery. Even I must remain anonymous." The gentlemen seated around him nodded gravely. "Well, of course," said the Baron with eagerness. "Of course." "We will refer to it," said the gentleman with the black pearl, "as the story of the naval attaché." "I arrived to London 2 days ago," said the American, "and I engaged a room at the Bath Hotel. I know very few people in London, and even the members of our embassy are strangers to me. But in Hong Kong I became great pals with an officer in your navy, who has since retired, and was now living in a small house in Rutland Gardens, opposite of Knightsbridge Barracks. I telegraphed him that I was in London, and yesterday morning I received a very hearty invitation to dine with him the same evening at his house. He is a bachelor, so we dined alone and talked over our old days at Asiatic Station, and the changes which had come to us since we had last met there. As I was leaving the next morning for my post in Petersburg, and had many letters to write, I told him about 10 o'clock that I must get back to my hotel, and he sent out some servant to call his hansom. For the next quarter of an hour, as we sat talking, we could hear the cab whistle sounding violently from the doorstep, but apparently with no result. "It cannot be that the cabmen are on strike," my friend said, as he rose and walked towards the window. He pulled back the curtains and at once called to me. "Have you ever seen a London fog, have you?" he asked. "Well, come here. This is one of the best, or rather, one of the worst of them." I joined him at the window, but I could see nothing. Had I not known that the house looked upon the street, I would have believed I was facing a dead wall. He raised the sash and stretched out my head, but still I could see nothing. Even the light at the end of Even the light of the street lamps opposite, and in the upper windows of the barracks, had been smothered by the yellow mist. The lights in the room in which I stood penetrated the fog only to the distance of a few inches before my eyes. Below me, the servant was still sounding his whistle, but I could not afford to wait any longer, and I told my friend that I would try to find a way back to the hotel on foot. He objected, but the letters I had to write were for the Naval Department, and besides, I had always heard that to be out in London fog was the most wonderful experience, and I was curious to investigate one for myself. My friend went with me to his front door and laid down the course for me to follow. I was first to walk straight across the street to the brick wall of the Knightsbridge Barracks. I was to feel my way along the wall until I came to a few rows of houses set back from the sidewalk. They would bring me to a cross street. On the other side of the street was a row of shops which I was to follow until they joined the iron railings of Hyde Park. I was to keep with the railings until I reached the gates of Hyde Park Corner, where I was to lay a diagonal course across Piccadilly and track toward the railings of Green Park. At the end of these railings, going east, I was to find the Walsingham and my own hotel. To a sailor, of course, this did not seem difficult, so I bade my friend good night and walked forward until my feet touched the wooden paving. I continued upon it until I reached a curbing on the sidewalk. A few steps farther, my hand struck the wall of the barracks. I turned in the direction from which I had just come and saw a square of faint light cut through the yellow fog. I shouted, "All right!" to my friend's voice answered, "Good luck to you." The light from his door disappeared with a bang, and I was left alone in the dripping yellow darkness. I have been in the Navy for 10 years, and I have never known such a fog as that of last night. Not even among the icebergs of the Bering Sea. There one could at least see the light of a barnacle, but last night I could not even distinguish my hand by which I guided myself on the barrack wall. At sea, a fog is a natural phenomenon, as it is familiar as a rainbow which follows a storm. It is as proper as a fog should spread upon the waters as a steam shall rise from a kettle. But a fog which rolls in from paved streets, that rolls between solid house fronts and forces cabs to move at half speed, that drowns policemen and extinguishes the electrical lights from the music hall, that to me is incomprehensible. It was as out of place as a tidal wave on Broadway. As I felt my way along the wall, I encountered other men who were coming from the opposite direction, and each time when we hailed each other, I stepped away from the wall to make room for them to pass. The third time I did this, when I recalled out my hand, the wall had disappeared, and the further I moved to find it, the further I seemed to be sinking into space. I had an unpleasant conviction that at any moment I might step over a precipice. Since I had set out, I had heard no traffic in the street, and now, although I listened some minutes, I could only distinguish the occasional footfalls of pedestrians. Several times I had called aloud, and once a jocular gentleman answered me, but only to ask where I thought I was. And then even he was swallowed up by the silence. Just above me I could make out a jet of gas which I guessed was from the street lamp, and I moved over to that, and while I tried to recover my bearings, kept my hand on the iron post. Except for this flicker of gas, no larger than the tip of my finger, I could distinguish nothing about me. For the rest, the mist hung between me and the world like a damp and heavy blanket. I could hear voices, but I could not tell whence they came, and the scrape of a foot moving cautiously, or a muffled cry of someone, stumbled out of only sounds that reached me. I decided that I had best remain where I was until someone took me in tow, and it might have been best to have been about 10 minutes that I waited, straining my ears and hailing distant footfalls. In a house near me, some people were dancing to the music of a Hungarian band. I even fancied that I could hear the windows shake in the rhythm of their feet, but I could not make out from which part of the compass the sounds came. And sometimes, as the music rose, it seemed to close at my hand, and again to be floating high in the air above my head. Although I was surrounded by thousands of householders, 13, I was completely lost, as though I had been set down by night in the Sahara Desert. There seemed to be no use in waiting longer for an escort, so I set out again and at once bumped against a low iron fence. At first I believed this to be a railing area, but on following it I found that it stretched on for a long distance, and that it had piercings at regular intervals with gates. I was standing uncertainly with my hand upon one of these when a square of light suddenly opened in the night, and in it I saw what you see in a picture thrown on a photograph in a darkened theater. A young gentleman in evening dress, and at the back of him the lights of the hall. I guessed from its elevation and distance at the sidewalk that this must be from the door in the house set back from the street, and I determined to approach it and ask the young man to tell me where I was. But in fumbling with the lock on the gate, I instinctively bent my head, and when I raised it again, the door had partly closed, leaving only a narrow shaft of light. Whether the young man had re-entered the house or had left it, I could not tell, but I hastened to open the gate, and as I stepped forward, I found myself upon an asphalt walk. At the same instant, there was also a sound of quick steps upon the path, and someone rushed past me. I called to him, but he made no reply, and I heard the gate click and the footsteps hurrying along the sidewalk. Under other circumstances, the young man's rudeness and his recklessness in dashing so hurriedly through the mist would have struck me as peculiar, but everything was so distorted by the fog that at the moment I did not even consider it. The door was still as he had left it, partly open. I went up the path, and after much fumbling, found the knob and the doorbell and gave it a sharp pull. The bell answered me from a great depth and distance, but no movement followed from inside the house. And, although I pulled the bell again and again, I could hear nothing save the dripping of the mist about me. I was anxious to be on my way, but unless I knew my way, there was little chance of me making any speed, and I was determined that until I learned my bearings, I would not venture back into that fog. So I pushed the door open and stepped into the house. I found myself in a long and narrow hall upon which doors opened from either side. At the end of the hall was a staircase with a balustrade which ended in a sweeping curve. The balustrade was covered with heavy Persian rugs, and the walls of the hall were also hung with them. The door on my left was closed, but the one near me on the right was open, and as I stepped opposite to it, I saw that it was a sort of reception or waiting room, and that it was empty. The door below it was also open. and with the idea that I would surely find someone in there, I walked up to the hill. I was in evening dress, and I felt I did not look like a burglar, so I had no great fear that I should encounter one of the inmates of the house who would shoot me on sight. The second door of the hall opened into a dining room. This was also empty. One person had been dining at the table, but the cloth had not been cleared away, and the flickering candles showed half-filled wine glasses and ashes of cigarettes. The greater part of the room was still in complete darkness. By this time I had grown conscious of the fact that I was wandering about in a strange house that apparently I was alone in. The silence of the place began to try on my nerves, and in a sudden, unexplainable panic I started for the open street. As I turned, I saw a man sitting on a bench at the curve of the balustrade had been hidden from me. His eyes were shut, and he was sleeping soundly. The moment before I had been bewildered because I had seen no one, but at sight of this man I was much more bewildered. He was a very large man, a giant in height, with long yellow hair which hung below his shoulders. He was dressed in a red silk shirt that was belted at the waist and hung outside of black velvet trousers which, in turn, were stuffed into high black boots. I recognized the costume as that of one of the Russian servants in his native livery, but what he could be doing in a private home in Knightsbridge was incomprehensible. I advanced and touched the man on the shoulder, and after an effort he woke and, seeing me, sprang to his feet and began bowing rapidly and making deprecatory gestures. I had picked up enough Russian in Petersburg to make out that the man was apologizing for having fallen asleep, and I was also able to explain to him that I was desiring to see his master. He nodded vigorously and said, "Will His Excellency come this way? The princess is here." I distinctly made out the word princess, and I was a good deal embarrassed. I thought it would be easy enough to explain my intrusion to a man, but how a woman would look on it is another matter, and as I followed him down the hall, I was somewhat puzzled. As we advanced, he noticed that the front door was standing open, and giving an exclamation of surprise, hastened forward and closed it. Then he rapped twice on the door that apparently was a drawing room. There was no reply to his knock, and he tapped again, and then timidly and cringingly subserviently the door was opened, and he stepped inside. He withdrew himself almost at once and stared stupidly at me, shaking his head. "She is not here," he said. He stood for a moment, gazing blankly through the open door, and then hastened towards the dining room. The solitary candle which still burned there seemed to assure him that this room was also empty. He came back and bowed to me in the drawing room. "She is above," he said. "I will inform the princess of the Excellency's presence." Before I could stop him, he had turned and was running up the staircase, leaving me alone at the open door of the drawing room. I decided that the adventure had gone quite far enough, and that if I had been able to explain to the Russian that I had lost my way in the fog and now only wanted to get back to the street again, I would have left the home on that instant. Of course, when I first rang the bell of the house, I had no other expectation that would be answered by a parlor maid who would direct me on my way. I certainly could not have foreseen that I would disturb a Russian princess in her boudoir, or that I might be thrown out by her athletic bodyguard. Still, I thought I ought not now leave the house without making some kind of apology, and if the worst should come, I could show my card. I could hardly believe that the member of the embassy had any designs upon the hat rack. The room in which I stood was dimly lighted, but I could see that, like the hall, it was hung with heavy Persian rugs. The corners were filled with palms, and there was an unmistakable odor in the air of Russian cigarettes and strange, dry scents that carried me back to the bazaars of the Vladislav. Near the front windows was a grand piano, and at the other end of the room was a heavily carved screen of some black wood picked out with ivory. The screen was overhung with a canopy of silken draperies and formed a sort of alcove. In front of the alcove was spread a white skin of a polar bear, and set on that was one of those low Turkish coffee tables. I held a lighted spirit lamp and 2 gold coffee cups. I had heard no movement from upstairs, and must have been fully 3 minutes that I stood waiting, noting these details on the room and wondering what the delay and what about the strange silence. And then, suddenly, as my eye grew more used to the half-light, I saw projecting from behind the screen as though it were stretched along the back of a divan, the hand of a man and the lower part of his arm. I was startled as though I'd come across a footprint on a deserted island. Evidently the man had been sitting there ever since I came into the room, or even since I had entered the house, and he had heard the servant knocking upon the door, but why had he not declared himself? I could not understand. But I suppose that possibly he was a guest, and with no reason to interest himself in the princess's other visitors, or perhaps for some reason he did not wish to be observed. I could see nothing of him except his hand, but I had an unpleasant feeling that he had been peering at me through the carvings in the screen, and that he was still doing so. I moved my feet noisily on the floor and said tentatively, "I beg your pardon." There was no reply, and the hand did not stir. Apparently the man was bent upon ignoring me, but as all I wished was to apologize for my intrusion and to leave the house, I walked up to the alcove and peered around it. Inside the screen was a divan, piled with cushions, and on the end of it, near me, the man was sitting. He was a young Englishman with light yellow hair and a deeply bronzed face. He was seated with his arms stretched out along the back of the divan, and with his hand resting against the cushion. His attitude was one of complete ease, but his mouth had fallen open, and his eyes were set with an expression of utter horror. At the first glance I saw that he was quite dead. For a flash of time I was too startled to act, but in the same flash I was convinced that the man had met his death from no accident, and that he had not died through any ordinary failure of the laws of nature. The expression on his face was much too terrible to be misinterpreted. I spoke as eloquently as words. It told me that before the end had come, he had watched his death approach and threaten him. I was so sure that he had been murdered that I instinctively looked on the floor for a weapon, and at the same moment I held out concern for my own safety. Quickly behind me, the silence of the house continued unbroken. I had just seen a great number of dead men, as I was on the Asiatic station during the Chinese-Japanese War, and I was in Port Arthur after the massacre. So, a dead man for the single reason that he's dead does not repel me, and though I knew that there was no hope for this man was alive, still, for decency's sake, I felt for a pulse. And while I kept my ears alert for any sound from the floors above me, and I pulled open his shirt and placed my hand upon his heart. My fingers instantly touched upon the opening of a wound, and as I withdrew them, I found them wet with blood. He was in evening dress, and the wide bosom of his shirts I found narrow slits, so narrow that in the dim light it was scarcely discernible. The wound was no wider than the smallest blade of a pocket knife, but when I stripped the shirt away from the chest and left it bare, I found that the weapon, narrow as it was, had been long enough to reach his heart. There was no need to tell you how I felt as I stood by the body of this boy, for he was hardly older than a boy, or the thoughts that came into my head. I was bitterly sorry for the stranger, bitterly indignant at his murderer, and at the same time selfishly concerned for my own safety and for the notoriety which I saw was sure to follow. My instinct was to leave the body where it lay and hide myself in the fog, but I also felt that since a succession of accidents had made me the only witness to a crime, my duty was to make myself a good witness and to assist to establish the facts of this murder. That it might possibly be a suicide and not a murder did not disturb me for a moment. The fact that the weapon had disappeared and the expression on the boy's face were enough to convince at least me that he had no hand in his own death. I judged it, therefore, from the first importance to discover who was in the house, or, if they had escaped from it, who had been in the house before I entered it. I had seen one man leave it, but how I could tell from him was he was a young man, and that he was in evening dress, and that he had fled in such haste that he had not stopped to close the door behind him. The Russian servant I had found apparently asleep, and unless he acted a part with extreme skill, was as stupid and ignorant boor as innocent in murder as myself. There he was, the Russian princess whom he had expected to find, or had pretended to expect to find, in the same room with the murdered man. I judged that she now must be either upstairs with the servant, or that she had, without his knowledge, already fled from the house. When I recalled his apparently genuine surprise at not finding her in the drawing room, the latter supposition seemed to be more probable. Nevertheless, I decided that it was my duty to make a search, and after a second hurried look for the weapon among the cushions and the divan upon the floor, I cautiously crossed the hall and entered the dining room. The single candle was still flickering in the draught, and showed me the white cloth. The rest of the room was draped in shadows. I picked up the candle and, lifting it high above my head, moved around the corner of the table. Either my nerves were on such a stretch that no shock could strain them further, or my mind was inoculated to horrors, for I did not cry out at what I saw, nor retreat from it. Immediately at my feet was the body of a beautiful woman, lying at full length upon the floor, her arms flung out on either side of her, and her face white, and her shoulders gleaming dully in the unsteady light of the candle. Around her throat was a great chain of diamonds, and the light played upon these and made the flash and blaze in tiny flames. But the woman who wore them was dead, and I was so certain as how she had died that without an instant's hesitation I dropped on my knees beside her and placed my hand above her heart. My fingers again touched the thin slit of the wound. I had no doubt in my mind, but this was the Russian princess, and when I lowered the candle to her face, I was assured that this was so. Her features showed the finest lines of both the Slav and the Jewess. The eyes were black and the hair blue-black, and wonderfully heavy, and her skin, even in death, was rich in color. She was a surpassingly beautiful woman. I rose and tried to light another candle with the one I held, but I found that my hand was so unsteady that I could not keep the wicks together. It was my intention to again search for the strange dagger which had been used to kill both the English boy and the beautiful princess, but before I could light the second candle I heard the footsteps descending the stairs, and the Russian servant appeared in the doorway. My face was in darkness, or I am sure that the sight of it would have taken him by alarm, for at the moment I was not sure that this man himself was the murderer. His own face was painfully visible to me, and in the light of the hall I could see that he wore an expression of dull bewilderment. I stepped quickly towards him and took the firm hold upon his wrist. "She is not there," he said. "The princess is gone. They have all gone." "Who have gone?" I demanded. "Who else has been here?" "The two English gentlemen." "What two Englishmen?" I demanded. "What are their names?" The man now saw by my manner that some question of great moment hung upon his answer, and he began to protest that he did not know the names of the visitors, and that until the evening he had never seen them. I guess that it was in my tone which frightened him, and I took my hand off his wrists and spoke less eagerly. "How long have they been here?" I asked, "and when did they go?" He pointed behind him toward the drawing room. "One sat there with the princess," he said. "The other came after I was placed at coffee in the drawing room. The two Englishmen talked together, and the princess returned here to the table. She sat there in that chair, and I brought her cognac and cigarettes. Then I sat outside upon the bench. It was a feast day, and I had been drinking. Pardon, Excellency, but I fell asleep. When I woke, your Excellency was standing by me, but the princess and the two Englishmen had gone. That is all I know." I believed that the man was telling me the truth. His fright had passed, and he was now apparently puzzled, but not alarmed. Now I'm going to have that song in my head. "You must remember the names of the Englishmen," I urged. "Try to think. When you announced them to the princess, what name did you give?" At the question he exclaimed with pleasure, and beckoning me, he ran hurriedly down the hall and into the drawing room. In the corner farthest from the screen was a piano, and on it was a silver tray. He picked this up, and smiling with pride at his own intelligence, pointed at two cards that lay upon it. I took them up and read the names engraved upon them. The American paused abruptly and glanced at the faces around him. "I read the names," he repeated. He spoke with great reluctance. "Continue," nodded the baronet sharply. "I read the names," said the American with evident distaste, "and the family name on each was the same. They were names of two brothers. One is well known to you, and that is the African explorer to whom this gentleman was just speaking. I mean, the Earl of Chetney. The other was the name of his brother, Lord Arthur Chetney." The men at the table fell back as though a trapdoor had fallen open at their feet. "Lord Chetney!" they exclaimed in chorus. They glanced at each other and back to the American, with every expression of concern and disbelief. "This isn't possible," cried the baronet. "Why, my dear sir, young Chetney only arrived from Africa yesterday, and was so stated in the evening papers." The jaw of the American set in a resolute square, and his lips pressed together. "You are perfectly right, sir," he said. "Lord Chetney did arrive in London yesterday morning, and yesterday night I found his dead body." The youngest member present was the first to recover. He seemed much less concerned over the identity of the murdered man than the interruption of the narrative. "Oh, please let him go on," he cried. "What happened then? You say you found two visiting cards. How do you know which man was the one that murdered him, then?" The American, before he answered, waited until the chorus of exclamations had ceased. Then he continued as though he had not been interrupted. "The instant I read the names upon the cards," he said, "I ran to the screen and, kneeling beside the dead man, began the search through his pockets. My hand at once fell upon a card case, and I found on the cards it contained the title of Earl of Chetney. His watch and cigarette also bore the same name. These evidences and the fact of his bronze skin and his cheekbones were worn with fever convinced me that the dead man was the African explorer, and that the boy who fled past me in the night was Arthur, his younger brother. I was so intent upon my search that I had forgotten the servant, and I was still on my knees when I heard the cry behind me. I turned and saw the man gazing down at the body in abject and unspeakable horror. Before I could rise, he gave another cry of terror, and flinging himself into the hall, raced towards the door to the street. I leaped after him, shouting to him to halt, but before I could reach the hall, he had torn open the door, and I saw him spring out into the yellow fog. I cleared the steps in a jump and ran down the garden walk, but just as the gate clicked in front of me, I had it open in an instant, and following the sound of the man's footsteps, I raced after him into the open street. He also could hear me, and instantly stopped running, and there was absolute silence. He was so near that I almost fancied I could hear him panting, and I held my own breath to listen, but I could distinguish nothing but the dripping of the mist around us. and from far off the music of the Hungarian band, which I had heard when I first lost myself. Okay, gonna have to pause there because we're about to hit ads. So, feel free, take a break, stretch if you need to. And we will be back in a bit. Where did you come from? Where did you go? Where did you come? Did it come behind you? Right. Okay, looks like we should be back. Kill has not announced that we're back yet. I don't think she posted a trivia question either. Nope, she did not do a trivia question this time. Anyway. Back to In the Fog. All I could see was a square of light from the door I had left open behind me, and the lamp of the hall beyond it flickering in the dark. But even as I watched, and the flame of the lamp was blown violently to and fro, and the door caught some current of air, closed slowly. I knew that if it shut, I would not again enter the house, and I rushed madly towards it. I believe I even shouted out, as though it were something human which I could compel to obey me, and then I caught my foot against the curb and smashed into the sidewalk. When I rose to my feet, I was dizzy and half stunned, and though I thought then that I was moving towards the door, I know now that I probably turned directly from it. For as I groped about in the night, calling frantically for the police, my fingers touched nothing but the dripping fog, and the iron railings for which I saw it seemed to have melted away. For many minutes I beat the mist with my arms, like a man at blind man's bluff, turning sharply in circles, cursing aloud at my stupidity, and crying continually for help. At last a voice answered me from the fog, and I found myself held in the circle of a policeman's lantern. That is the end of my adventure. What I have to tell you now is what I learned from the police. At the station house to which the man guided me, I related what you have just heard. I told them that the house they find was one set back from the others, from a street within a radius of 200 yards from Knightsbridge Barracks, that within 50 yards of it someone was giving a dance to the music of a Hungarian band, that the railings in front of it were as high as a man's waist and filed to a point. With that to work upon, 20 men were at once ordered out of the fog to search for the house, and Inspector Lyle himself was dispatched to the home of Lord Edam, Chetna's father, with a warrant for Lord Arthur's arrest. I was thanked and dismissed on my own recognition. This morning, Inspector Lyle called me, and from him I learned the police theory of the scene I have just described. Apparently I had wandered very far in the fog, and up to noon today the house had not been found, nor had they been able to arrest Lord Arthur. He did not return to his father's house last night, and there is no trace of him. But from what the police knew of the past lives of the people I found and the lost house, they have evolved a theory. And their theory is that the murders were committed by Lord Arthur. The infatuation of his elder brother, Lord Chesney, for a Russian princess, so Inspector Lyle tells me, is well known to everyone. About 2 years ago, the Princess Zilchi, as she calls herself, and he were constantly together, and Chetney informed his friends that they were about to be married. The woman was notorious in 2 continents, and when Lord Edam heard of his son's infatuation, he appealed to the police for her record. It is through this, having applied them, that they know so much concerning her and her relation with the Chetneys. From the police, Lord Edam learned that Madame Zilchi had once been a spy in the employ of the Russian Third Section, but that lately she had been repudiated by her own government and was living by her wits, by blackmail, and by her beauty. Lord Edam laid this record before his son, but Chetney either knew it already or the woman persuaded him not to believe it, and the father and son parted in great anger. 2 days later, the Marquis altered his will, leaving all the money to his younger brother Arthur. The title and some of the landed property could not keep from the Chetney, but he swore that his son saw the woman again, that the will would stand as it was, and he would be left without a penny. This was about 18 months ago. Then apparently the Chetney tired of the princess and suddenly went off to shoot and explore in Central Africa. No word came from him except that twice he was reported to having died of the fever in the jungle, and that apparently 2 traders reached the coast who said they had seen his body. This was accepted by All was conclusive, and young Arthur was recognized as the heir to the head of millions. On the strength of his supposition, he at once began to borrow enormous sums from moneylenders. This is of great importance, as the police believe it was one of those debts which drove him to the murder of his brother. Yesterday, as you know, Lord Chetney suddenly returned from the grave, and it was the fact that for 2 years he had been considered dead which lent the importance to his return, and which gave rise to the columns of details concerning him which appeared in all the afternoon papers. But obviously, during his absence, he had not tired of the Princess Zelchi, for we know that a few hours after he reached London he sought her out. His brother had also learned of the reappearance through the papers, probably suspected the house he would first visit, and followed him there, arriving, so the Russian servant tells us, while the two were at coffee in the drawing room. The princess then, we also learned from the servant, withdrew to the dining room, leaving the brothers together. What happened, one can only guess. Lord Arthur knew that when he discovered that he was no longer the heir to the moneylenders would come down upon him, the police believed that he had once sought out his brother to beg for money and to cover the post-obits, but that, considering the sum he needed was several hundreds of thousands of pounds, Chetney refused to give it to him. No one knew that Arthur had gone to seek out his brother, and they were alone. It was possible then that the passion of disappointment and the craze with the disgrace which he saw before him, young Arthur made himself the heir beyond further question. The death of his brother would have availed nothing if the woman remained alive. It is as possible that he crossed the hall, and with the same weapon he made him Lord Eden's heir, destroyed the solitary witness to the murder. The only other person who could have seen it was sleeping in a drunken stupor to which the fact undoubtedly he owed his life. And yet, concluded the naval attaché, leaning forward and marking each word with his finger, Lord Arthur blundered fatally. In his haste he left the door to the house open, so giving to the first passer-by, and he forgot that when he entered he had handed his card to the servant. That piece of paper may yet send him to the gallows. In the meantime he has disappeared completely, and somewhere in one of the millions of streets of this great capital, in a locked and empty house, lies the body of his brother, and of the woman his brother loved, undiscovered, unburied, and with their murder unavenged. In the discussion which followed the conclusion of the story, the naval attaché, the gentleman with the pearl, took no part. Instead, he arose, and beckoning a servant to the far corner of the room, whispered earnestly to him, and a sudden movement on the part of Sir Andrew caused him to return hurriedly to the table. "There are several points in Mr. Sears' story I want explained," he cried. "Be seated, Lord Andrew," he begged. "Let us have the opinion of an expert. I do not care what the police think. I want to know what you think." But Sir Andrew rose reluctantly from his chair. "I should like nothing better than to discuss this," he said, "but it is most important that I should proceed to the house. I should have been there some time ago." He turned towards the servant and directed him to call a hansom. This gentleman with the pearl stud looked appealingly at the naval attaché. "There are surely more details that you have not told us," he urged. "Some you have forgotten." The baronet interrupted quickly. "I trust not," he said, "for I could not possibly stop to hear them." "The story is finished," declared the naval attaché. "Until Lord Arthur is arrested and the bodies are found, there is nothing more to tell of the Chetney or of Princess Zelchi." "Lord Chetney, perhaps not," interrupted the sporting-looking gentleman with the black tie. "But there will always be something to tell of Princess Zelchi. I know enough stories about her to fill a book. She was a most remarkable woman." The speaker dropped the end of his cigar into the coffee cup, and taking his case from his pocket, selected a fresh one. As he did so, he laughed and held up the case that others could see. It was an ordinary cigar case with well-worn pigskin, with a silver clasp. The only time I ever met her, he said, she tried to rob me.
Okay, who are you? How did you find me?
Hey, Micah. I was missed. It's always nice to come back to myself. It's always funny seeing my own poster up that I wasn't. I'm just as good. I'm lost just like they wanted. Oh yeah, easy to get lost in that game. One of those games that I wish I'd actually kept the disc in the box for. You know, as usual, if you need to relax, stretch out, feel free. I do like the retro feel. That's it. Hope you recover well. Let's see. The only time I ever met her, he said, she tried to rob me of this. The baronet regarded him closely. She tried to rob you? He repeated. Tried to rob me of this, continued the gentleman with the black tie, and of the Tsarina's diamonds. His tone was one of mingled admiration and injury. The Tsarina's diamonds! Exclaimed the baronet. He glanced quickly and suspiciously at the speaker, and then at the others around the table, but their faces gave evidence of no other emotion than that of ordinary interest. Yes, the Tsarina's diamonds, repeated the man with the black tie. It was a necklace of diamonds. I was told to take them to the Russian ambassador in Paris, who was to deliver them to Moscow. I am the Queen's messenger, he added. Oh, I see, exclaimed Sir Andrew in a tone of relief. And you say this same Princess Zilchi, one of the victims of this double murder, endeavored to rob you of that cigar case. And the Tsarina's diamonds, answered the Queen's messenger interrogatively. It's not much of a story, but it gives you an idea of the woman's character. The robbery took place between Paris and Marseille. The baronet interrupted him with an abrupt movement. No, no, he cried, shaking his arms in protest. Don't tempt me. I really can't listen. I must be at the house in 10 minutes. I'm sorry, said the Queen's messenger. He turned to those seated around him. I wonder if the other gentleman, he inquired tentatively. There was a chorus of polite murmurs, and the Queen's messenger, bowing his head in acknowledgment, took the preparatory sip from his glass. At the same moment, the servant to whom the man with the black pearl had spoken to slipped a piece of paper into his hand, and glanced at it, frowned, and threw it to the table. The servant bowed to the baronet. Oh, handsome is waiting, Sir Andrew, he said. The necklace is worth 20,000 pounds, began the Queen's messenger. And I was to present it to the Queen of England to celebrate. The baronet gave an exclamation of angry annoyance. Upon my words, this is most provoking, he interrupted. I really ought not to stay, but I certainly mean to hear this. He turned irritably to the servant. Tell the hansom to wait, he commanded, and with an air of a boy who is playing truant, skipped guiltily into his chair. The gentleman with the black pearl smiled blandly and rapped upon the table. Order, gentlemen, he said. Order of the store of the Queen's Messenger and the Tsarina's diamonds. And thus, we enter part 2. In the Fog, number 2. The story of the Queen's Messenger. The necklace was a present from the Queen of England to the Tsarina of Russia, began the Queen's Messenger. It was to celebrate the occasion of the Tsar's coronation. Our foreign officer knew that the Russian ambassador to Paris was to proceed to Moscow for that ceremony, and I was directed to go to him in Paris in order to hand over the necklace. But when I reached Paris, I found that he was not expecting me for a week later, and was taking a few days' vacation in Nice. His people asked me to leave the necklace with them at the embassy, but I had been charged to get the receipts from it from the ambassador himself, so I started at once to Nice. The fact that Monte Carlo was not 2,000 miles from Nice may have had something to do with me making and carry out my instructions so carefully. Now, how the Princess Sochi came to find out about the necklace I don't know, but I can guess. As you have just heard, she was at one time a spy at the service of the Russian government, and after they dismissed her, she kept up her acquaintances with many of the Russian agents in London. It was probably through one of them that she learned the necklace was to be sent to Moscow, and the Queen's messengers had been detailed to take it there. Still, I doubt even that knowledge would have helped her if she had not also known something which I suppose no one else in the world knew but myself and the other man. And curiously enough, the other man was the Queen's messenger too, and a friend of mine. You must know that, up to the time of this robbery, I had always concealed my dispatches in a matter of particularly my own. I got the idea from that play called A Scrap of Paper. In it, a man wants to hide a certain compromising document. He knows that all his rooms will be secretly searched for it, so he prints on a torn envelope and sticks it up anywhere we can see it on the mantel shelf. The result of the woman who was ransacking the house to find it looks in all unlikely places but passes over the scrap paper that is under her nose. Sometimes the papers or packages they give to carry in Europe are of great value, and sometimes are special makes of cigarettes and orders to court dressmakers. Sometimes we know what we are carrying, and sometimes we do not. If it is a large sum of money or treaty, they generally tell us, but as a rule, we have no knowledge of what the package contains, so to be on the safe side, we naturally take just as great care of it as though we held the terms of ultimatum or the crown jewels. As a rule, my confidants carry the official packages in a dispatch box, which is just as obvious to a lady's jewel bag in the hands of her maid. Everyone knows they are carrying something of value. They put a premium on dishonesty. Well, after I saw the scrap of paper play, I determined to put the government valuables in one of the most unlikely places that anyone would look for them. So I used to hide documents they gave me inside my riding boots or in small articles like jewelry or money. And I carried an old cigar case. After I took to using my case for that purpose, I bought a new one, exactly like it, for my cigars. But to avoid mistakes, I had my initials placed on both sides of the new one, and the moment I touched the case, even in the dark, I could tell which one it was by the raised initials. No one knew about this except the Queen's messenger of whom I spoke. We once left Paris together on the Orient Express, and I was going to Constantinople and he was to stop at Vienna. On the journey I told him of my peculiar way of hiding things and showed him my cigar case. If I recollect rightly, on that trip it was Grand Cross at St. Michael's and St. George which the Queen was sending to our ambassador. The messenger was very much entertained by my scheme, and some months later, when he met the princess, he told her about it, an amusing story. Of course, she had no idea that she was a Russian spy, and that didn't know anything at all about her except that she was a very attractive woman. It was indiscreet, but he could not possibly have guessed that she could ever make any use of what he had told her. Later, after the robbery, I remembered that I had informed the young chap of my secret hiding place, and when I saw him distressed and said he had never seen the importance of the secret, he remembered he had told several people about it, and among others, the Princess Zuchi. In that way, I found out that it was she who had robbed me, and I know that from the moment I had left London she was following me, and that she knew that the diamonds were concealed in my cigar case. My train for Nice left Paris at 10 in the morning. When I travel at night, I generally tell the chef de gare that I am a queen's messenger, and he gives me the compartment to myself. But in the daytime, I take whatever offers. On the morning, I had found an empty compartment, and I had tipped the guard to keep everybody else out, not from any fear of losing the diamonds, but because I wanted to smoke. I had locked the door, and at the last bell had rung, I supposed to have a travel alone, so I began to arrange my traps and make myself comfortable. The diamonds in my cigar case were in the inside pocket of my waistcoat, and as they made a bulky package, I took them out, intending to put them back in my handbag. It is a small satchel, like a bookmaker's, or those handbags the couriers carry. I wear it slung from a strap across my shoulder, and no matter whether I'm sitting or walking, it never leaves me. I took the cigar case which held the necklace from my inside pocket and the case which held the cigars out of the satchel, and while I was searching through it for a box of matches, I laid the two cases beside me on the seat. At that moment the train started, but at the same instant there was a rattle at my lock in the compartment, and a couple of porters lifted and shoved a woman through the door and buried her bags at her and umbrellas after her. Instinctively, I reached for the diamonds and shoved them quickly into the satchel, and pushing them far down at the bottom of the bag, snatched the lock spring. Then I put my cigars in my pocket of my coat, but with the thought that now I had a woman as a traveling companion, I should probably not be allowed to enjoy them. One of her pieces of luggage had fallen at my feet, and a roll of rugs was handed to my side. I thought if I hid the fact that the lady was not welcome and had at once started to be civil, she might permit me to smoke. So I picked up her handbag off the floor and asked her where I might place it. As I spoke, she looked at her face for the first time and saw that she was a most remarkably handsome woman. She smiled charmingly and begged me not to disturb myself. Then she arranged her own things about her and, opening her dressing bag, took out a gold cigarette case. "Do you mind if I smoke?" she said. I laughed and assured her that I had been in great terror lest she might not allow me to smoke. "Do you like cigarettes?" she said. "Will you try some of these? They're rolled especially for my husband in Russia, and they are supposed to be very good." I thanked her for one and took one from her case, and I found it so much better than my own that I continued to smoke her cigarettes throughout the rest of the journey. I must say that we had got on very well. I judged from the coronet on her cigarette case, and from her manner, which was quite well bred, that any woman I had ever met, that she was somewhat of importance, and though she seemed to be too good-looking to be respectable, I determined that she was some grande dame who so assured herself of a position that she could afford to be unconventional. At first she read her novel, and then she made some comment on the scenery, and finally we began to discuss the current politics of the continent. She talked of all the cities of Europe and seemed to know everyone worth knowing, but she volunteered nothing about herself except that she frequently made use of the expression, "when my husband was stationed at Vienna," or "when my husband was promoted to Rome." And once she said to me, "I have often seen you at Monte Carlo. I've seen when you won the pigeon championship." I told her that it was not a pigeon shot, and she gave a little start of surprise. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought you were Morton Hamilton, the English champion." As a matter of fact, I do look something like Hamilton. But I know now that her object was to make me think that she had no idea who I actually was. She didn't have acted at all, for I certainly had no suspicions, and was only too pleased to have so charming a companion. The one thing that should have made me suspicious was the fact that every station she made some trivial excuse to get me out of the compartment. She pretended that her maid was traveling behind us on the second-class carriages and kept saying that she could not imagine why the woman did not come look for her, and if I maid could not turn up the next stop, should I be very kind to get out and bring her whatever it was she pretended that she needed. I had taken my dressing case from the rack to get out a novel and had left it in the seat opposite of mine, and at the end of the compartment furthest from her. And once I came back from buying her a cup of chocolate, or some other fool errand, I found her standing at my end of the compartment with both hands in my dressing bag. She looked at me without so much as winking an eye and shoved the case carefully into a corner. "Your bag slipped on the floor," she said. "If you've got any bottles in it, you had better look to see if they're not broken." And I give you my word, I was such an ass that I did not open the case and look through it. She must have thought I was real juggins. I got hot all over whenever I remember it. But in spite of my dullness and her cleverness, I shouldn't gain anything by sending me away, because what she wanted was in the handbag, and every time she sent me away, the handbag went with me. After the incident with the dressing case, her manner began to change. Either she had had time to look through it in my absence, or when I was examining through it for broken bottles, she had seen everything it held. From that moment, she must have known for certain that the cigar case in which she knew I carried the diamonds in was in the bag that was fastened to my body, and from that time she was probably plotting on how to get it from me. Her anxiety became almost apparent. She dropped her great lady manner, and her charming disconcension went on. She ceased talking, and when I spoke, answered me irritably or at random. No doubt her mind was entirely consumed with her plan. At the end of our journey was drawing rapidly near, and her time for action was being cut down with the speed of the express train. Even I, unsuspicious as I was, noticed that something was very wrong with her. I really believe that before we reached Marseille, if I had not, through my own stupidity, given her the chance she wanted, she might have stuck a knife in me and rolled me out of the rails. But as it was, I only thought that the long journey had tired her. I suggested that it was a very tedious trip and asked her if she would allow us to offer some of my cognac. She thanked me and said no, and then suddenly her eyes lighted and she exclaimed, Yes, thank you, if you will be so kind." My flask was in my handbag, and I placed it on my lap, and with my thumb I slipped back the catch. I keep my tickets and the railroad guide in my bag, so I am constantly opening it, so that I never bother to lock it. And the fact that it was strapped to me has always been sufficient protection. But I can appreciate now what satisfaction, what torments too, it must have been to that woman when she saw that the bag opened without a key. While we were crossing the mountains, I had felt rather chilly and had been wearing a light racing coat. But after the lamps were lighted, the compartment became very warm and stuffy, and I found out my coat was uncomfortable. So I stood up, and after first slipping my strap off the bag over my head, I placed the bag on the seat next to me and pulled off the racing coat. I don't blame myself for being careless. The bag was still within reach of my hand, and nothing would have happened if at the exact moment the train had not stopped at ours. It was a combination of my removing the bag and our entering the station at the same instant which gave Princess Zochi the chance she wanted to rob me. I needn't say that she was clever enough to take it. The train ran at the station at full speed and came to a sudden stop. I had just thrown my coat onto the rack and had reached out my hand for the bag. In another instant I should have had the strap over my shoulder. But at that moment the princess threw open the door of my compartment and beckoned wildly at the people on the platform. "Natalie, Natalie," she called. "Natalie, here I am. Come here, this way." She turned upon me with great excitement. "My maid," she cried. "She is looking for me. She passed the window without seeing me. Go, please, and bring her back." She continued pointing out the door and beckoning me to her other hand. There certainly was something about that woman's tone which made one jump. When she was giving orders, you had no chance to think of anything else, so I rushed out of my errand of mercy, and rushed back again to ask what the maid looked like. "In black," she answered, rising and blocking the door of the compartment. "Oh, in black, with a bonnet." The train wasted 3 minutes at Aries, and in that time I suppose I must have rushed up to the 27 women and asked, "Are you Natalie?" The only reason I wasn't punched with an umbrella or handed over to some gardener must have been that they probably thought I was crazy. When I jumped back into the compartment and the princess was seated where I had left her, her eyes were burning with happiness. She placed her hand on my arm almost affectionately and said in a most hysterical way, "You are very kind to me. I am sorry to have troubled you." I protested that every woman on the platform was dressed in black. "Indeed, I am so sorry," she said, laughing. And she continued to laugh until she began to breathe so quickly that I thought she was going to faint. I can see now that the last part of the journey must have been a terrible half hour for her. She had the cigar case safe enough, but she knew that she herself was not safe. If she knew if I were to open my bag, even at the last minute, and miss the case, I should know positively that she had taken it. I had placed the diamonds in the bag at the very moment she entered the compartment, but no one but the 2 other selves had occupied it since. She knew that when we reached Marseille, she would either be 20,000 pounds richer than she had left Paris, or that she would go to jail. That was the situation as she must have read it, and I don't envy her state of mind during that last half hour. It must have been hell. I saw that something was wrong, and in my innocence I even wondered if possibly my cognac had not been a little too strong. For she suddenly developed into a most brilliant conversationalist, and applauded and laughed at everything I said, even firing off questions at me like a machine gun, so that I had no time to think of anything else but what she was saying. Whenever I stirred, she stopped her chattering and leaned forward to me and watched me like a cat over a mouse hole. I wondered how I could have not considered her an agreeable traveling companion. I thought I should have preferred to be locked in with a lunatic. I don't like to think how she would have acted had I made a move to examine the bag, but as I had it safely strapped around me again, I did not open it, and I reached Marseille alive. As we drove to the station, she shook hands with me and grinned like a Cheshire cat. "I cannot tell you," she said, "how much I have to thank you for." "How do you like that for impudence?" I offered to put her in a carriage, but she said that she must find Natalie, that she had hoped to meet again at the hotel. So I drove off by myself, wondering who she was and whether Natalie was her keeper or not. I had to wait several hours for the train to Nice, and I had waited to stroll around the city. I thought I had better put the diamonds in the safe at the hotel. As soon as I reached my room, I locked the door and placed the handbag on the table and opened it. I felt among the things on top of it, but failed to touch the cigar case. I shoved my hand in deeper and settled the earrings about, and I still had not reached it. A cold wave swept down my spine, and a sort of emptiness came to the pit of my stomach. Then I turned red hot, and the sweat sprang out all over me. I wetted my lips with my tongue and said to myself, "Don't be an ass. Pull yourself together. Pull yourself together. Take the things out, one at a time. It's there. Of course it's there. Don't be an ass." So I put my brake on my nerves and began carefully picking out the things one by one. But after 5 seconds, I could not stand it another instant, and I rushed across the room and threw everything on the bed. But the diamonds were not among them. I pulled the things about and tore them open and shuffled and rearranged and sorted them, but it was no use. The cigar case was gone. I threw everything in the dressing case out on the floor, though I knew it was useless to look for it there. I knew that I had put it in the bag. I sat down and tried to think. I remembered I had put it in the satchel in Paris just as the woman had entered the compartment, and I had been alone with her ever since, so it was she who had robbed me. But how? It had never left my shoulder, and then I remembered that I had taken it off when I had changed my coat for the few moments that I was searching for Natalie. I remembered the woman had sent me on that goose chase, and at every other station she had tried to get rid of me for some fool errand. I gave a roar like a mad bull and jumped down the 6 steps at a time. I demanded the office as if a distinguished lady traveler, possibly a Russian, had just entered the hotel. As I expected, she had not. I sprang into a cab and inquired at 2 other hotels, and then I saw the folly of trying to catch her without outside help, and I ordered the fellow to go up to the police office of the chief of police. I told my story, and the ass in charge asked me to calm myself down and wanted to take notes. I told him this was no time for note-taking, but for doing something. He got wrathy at that and demanded to be taken at once to his chief. The chief, he said, was very busy and could not see me, so I showed him my silver greyhound. In 11 years I had never used it but once before. I stated in pretty vigorous language that I was the Queen's messenger, and that if the chief of police did not see me instantly, he would lose his official head. The fellow jumped off his high horse at that and ran with me to his chief. A smart young chap, a colonel in the army, and a very intelligent man. I explained that I had been robbed in a French railway carriage of a diamond necklace that belonged to the Queen of England, which Her Majesty was sending as a present to the Tsarina of Russia. I pointed out to him that if he succeeded in capturing the thief, he would be made for life and would receive the gratitude of 3 great powers. He wasn't the sort that thinks second thoughts are best. He saw the Russian and French decorations spouting out all over his chest, and he hit a bell and pressed buttons and yelled out orders to the captain like a penny steamer in the fog. He sent out a description to all the city gates and ordered all cabmen and railway porters to search the trains leaving Marseille. He ordered all passengers on outgoing vessels to be examined and telegraphed the proprietors of every exchange and pension to send him a complete list of their guests within an hour. While I was standing there, he must have given at least 100 orders and sent out enough commissaires, sergeants de ville, and gardes bicycle police, and plainclothes Johnnies to have captured the entire German army. When they had gone, he assured me that the woman was as good as arrested already. Indeed, officially, she was arrested, for she had no more chance of escape from Marseille than I of the Chateau d'If. He told me to return to my hotel and possess my soul in peace. Within an hour, he assured me that he would acquaint me with her arrest. I thanked him and complimented him on his energy and left him, but I didn't share in his confidence. I felt that she was a very clever woman and a match for any and all of us. It was very well for him to be jubilant. He had not lost his diamonds, and had everything to gain if he found them, while I, even if he did recover the necklace, should only be where I was before I lost it. And if he did not recover it, I was a ruined man. It was an awful facer for me. I had always prided myself on my record. In 11 years I had never mislaid an envelope nor missed taking the first train. And now I had failed in the most important commission that had ever been entrusted to me. And it wasn't a thing that could be hushed up either. It was too conspicuous, too spectacular. It was sure to invite the wildest notoriety. I saw myself ridiculed all over the continent, perhaps dismissed, even suspected of having taken the thing myself. I was walking in front of a lighted cafe, and I felt so sick and miserable that I stopped for a pick-me-up. Then I considered that if I took 1 drink, I should probably, in my present state of mind, not want to stop another 20. And I decided I had better leave it alone. But my nerves were jumping like those of a frightened rabbit, and I felt I must have something to quiet them, or I shall go crazy. I reached for my cigarette case, and the cigarette seemed handily adequate, so I put it back again and took out my cigar case, in which I only keep the strongest and blackest of cigars. I opened it and stuck my fingers in, but instead of a cigar, they touched on a thin leather envelope. My heart stood perfectly still. I did not dare to look, but I dug my fingernails across the letters and felt the layers of the thin paper, then a layer of cotton. Then they scratched on the facets of the Zarina's diamonds. I stumbled as though I'd been hit in the face and fell back into one of the chairs on the pavement. I tore off the wrappings and spread the diamonds out on the cafe table. I could not believe they were real. I twisted the necklace between my fingers and crushed it between my palms and tossed it up into the air. I believe I almost kissed it. The women in the cafe stood up in chairs to see better and laughed and screamed, and people crowded so close around me that people and the waiters had to form a bodyguard. The proprietor thought there was a fight and he called for the police. I was so happy I didn't care. I laughed too and gave the proprietor a handful of coin and told him to stand everyone a drink. Then I tumbled into a fire and galloped off to my friend, the chief of police. I felt very sorry for him. He had been so happy at the chance I had given him, and he would be so disappointed when he learned that I had sent him off on a false alarm. But now that I had the necklace, I did not want him to find the woman. Indeed, I was most anxious that she should get clear away, for if she were caught, the truth would come out, and I was likely to get a sharp reprimand and be sure to be laughed at. I could see now how it had happened. In my haste to hide the diamonds when the woman had hustled into the carriage, I had shoved the cigars into the satchel, and now the diamonds into my pocket of my coat. Now that I had the diamonds safe again, it seems like a natural mistake, but I doubted if the Foreign Office would think so. I was afraid it might not appreciate the beautiful simplicity of my secret hiding place. So when I reached the police station and found the princess still at large, I was more relieved. As I expected, the chief was extremely chagrined when he learned of my mistake and that there was nothing for him to do. But I was feeling so happy myself that I hated to give anyone less miserable. So I suggested that this attempt to steal the Zarina's necklace might be only the first of a series of such attempts. And that I might still be in danger from an unscrupulous game. I winked at the chief, and the chief smiled at me, and we went to nice together in a saloon car, with a guard of 12 carabiners and 12 plainclothes men, and the chief and I drank champagne all the way. We marched together up the hotel where the Russian ambassador was stopping, closely surrounded by our escort of carabiners, and delivered the necklace with the most profound ceremony. The old ambassador was immensely impressed, and when he hinted that already I had been made the object of attack by robbers, he assured us that His High Imperial Majesty would not prove ungrateful. I wrote a swinging personal letter about the invaluable services of the chief of the French Minister of Foreign. I wrote a swinging personal letter about the invaluable services of the chief of the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that they gave him enough Russian and French medals to satisfy even a French soldier. So though he never caught the woman, he received his just reward. The Queen's messenger paused and surveyed the faces of those about him in some embarrassment. But the worst of it is, he added, that the story must have got about, for while the princess obtained nothing from me but a cigar case and 5 excellent cigars, a few weeks after the coronation of the Tsar sent me a gold cigar case with his monogram in diamonds. And I don't know yet whether that was coincidence or whether the Tsar wanted me to know that he knew that I had been carrying the Tsarina's diamonds in my pigskin cigar case. What do you fellows think? Oh, that was cool. And I know I don't have enough time for another story, so... Let's see who might be on to raid. Let's see, Jessica's watching Overwatch. 'Watch. computer is trying to freeze up on me already. I kind of miss doing those stories. I don't see any of the other people on my follow list that are doing reading and writing. Let's see who's on topic. If my computer will let me. Oh, my computer's not letting me do anything. Oh, looks like harp's on. Let's rate harp. Let's rate the harp. So again, thank you everyone for coming in, and thank you for the raid. I do have both follower and subscriber raid messages. You don't really have to be a subscriber because you can unlock the emote. Because I just use the read one, I believe. Yep, I just use the read emote. See how I can do Harp Griffin. Again, thank you everyone for coming in. Tomorrow will be fairy tales. So I hope to see you all then. In the meantime, have a good night, good evening, or whichever.
Say your prayers, little one. Don't forget, my son, to include everyone. Tuck you in, warm within, keep you free from sin, till the Sandman he comes. Sleep with one eye open, gripping your pillow tight.
Okay. So it's ready to read in
light.
2 seconds.
Enter night. Take my hand.
Okay.
We're off to Never
Have a good night.
Neverland. Something's wrong. Shut the light. Heavy thoughts tonight, and they aren't of Snow White. Dreams of war, dreams of liars, dreams of dragons, fire, and the things that will